The storm begins. Setting the stage. David Sinclair, a black billionaire and CEO of one of the world's most influential technology firms, was no stranger to first-class flights. For him, the luxury of a first-class seat wasn't about showing off wealth. It was about maintaining a routine that allowed him to relax and strategize for the challenges ahead. It was an ordinary Thursday morning when David boarded the flight. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, not flashy or loud, but with a presence that demanded respect. His finely tailored suit and minimalist leather briefcase were subtle reminders of his success. As David made his way to seat 1A, he noticed the cabin crew bustling about, checking last-minute arrangements. The faint hum of engines filled the air, and passengers filtered in slowly, their faces a mix of excitement and travel fatigue. The encounter. Just as David settled into his seat, a flight attendant with a crisp uniform and a stiff smile approached him. Her name tag read Rebecca Morrison. She was in her mid-30s, her demeanor sharp and commanding. "Excuse me, sir," she said with a tone that was polite on the surface but carried an edge. "It seems there's been a mix-up with your seat. I'll need you to move." David glanced at her, puzzled but calm. "I believe this is my seat," he said, pulling out his ticket and showing her the confirmation on his phone. Rebecca barely glanced at the screen. Her lips tightened. "There's been a last-minute adjustment. I'll have to ask you to move to another seat in the economy section." David frowned but remained composed. "I don't think that's necessary. My ticket clearly states this is my assigned seat." Her expression hardened. "Sir, I'm asking you to cooperate." The shift in atmosphere. Passengers in first class began to glance over, some whispering among themselves. David felt their eyes on him. Curious, judgmental, dismissive. He knew this wasn't just about a seat. The tone in Rebecca's voice, the dismissive glance, and the refusal to acknowledge his reservation spoke volumes. David leaned back slightly, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not moving. If there's an issue, I suggest you check with your supervisor." Rebecca's smile faltered. She turned sharply on her heel, disappearing behind the curtain leading to the galley. David's gaze followed her, his mind already piecing together what this encounter truly meant. The power play. Minutes later, a middle-aged man with a thinning hairline and a polished name badge approached. Paul Richardson, flight supervisor. He crouched slightly beside David, adopting a practiced smile. "Mr. Sinclair, I apologize for the confusion, but we really need you to relocate to another seat. I hope you understand this is just procedure." David's eyes met Paul's, steady and unyielding. "No, I don't understand. This seat was reserved and confirmed. I'd like to know why you're asking me to move." Paul hesitated, his smile thinning. "It's just a minor mix-up. We'll make it up to you." David could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about procedure, it was about perception. Who belonged where? Who was allowed to claim space without question? After a long pause, David stood. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he gathered his belongings and walked to the back of the plane, escorted by Rebecca, who now wore a triumphant smirk. The tension builds. As David settled into the cramped seat in economy, sandwiched between two strangers, the weight of the injustice settled on him. He wasn't angry, he was focused. This wasn't just about him. It was about the unspoken rules that allowed moments like this to happen over and over again, unchecked and unchallenged. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. One name stood out: James Porter, CEO of the airline. David's finger hovered over the number. Not yet, he thought. There was a time for action, and that time was drawing near. The first ripples. 10 minutes after takeoff, the cabin crew's demeanor began to shift. Rebecca's confident stride faltered as whispers passed among the attendants. David noticed Paul making hushed phone calls from the galley. The passengers around him exchanged puzzled glances, sensing that something was brewing. David remained silent, his gaze fixed out the window, but his presence was unmistakable. He wasn't a man to be dismissed easily, and the ripple effects of his quiet defiance had only just begun. The ripple effect. The plane cruised at 35,000 feet, but the tension in the cabin was far from steady. David Sinclair sat in his cramped seat in economy, his long legs brushing uncomfortably against the tray table. The hum of the engines filled the silence around him, but inside, his thoughts churned like a storm. The man beside him shifted awkwardly, casting occasional glances at David. He clearly recognized him, perhaps from a news article or a feature in a business magazine. David Sinclair wasn't just another passenger. He was a household name in tech and innovation, the man who had revolutionized industries. David noticed the glances but ignored them. Instead, he focused on his phone. He opened an email chain from his executive assistant, Jasmine, detailing the week ahead, meetings with venture capitalists, a charity gala, and the launch of a new educational initiative for underprivileged children. The weight of his schedule should have been consuming him, but instead, his thoughts remained on the events of the last 30 minutes. Subtle shifts in the cabin. As the flight attendants began their service, the ripple effects of David's quiet refusal started to show. Rebecca Morrison passed through the economy cabin, her movements brisk but no longer confident. She avoided David's gaze entirely, her posture stiff and uneasy. Paul Richardson, the flight supervisor, lingered in the galley, speaking in hushed tones to a member of the cabin crew. David could hear snippets of the conversation when they leaned too close to the curtain. Words like misunderstanding, protocol, and corporate floated back to him. David smiled faintly, but it wasn't a smile of satisfaction. He recognized the signs of damage control, the frantic attempts to patch a leak before it became a flood. David's quiet action. David's phone buzzed in his hand. A message from Jasmine. Jasmine, need me to handle this? You know I can. David's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Jasmine was efficient and ruthless when needed. She could escalate this situation in minutes with a few well-placed calls. But David wasn't ready to let her intervene. Not yet. Instead, he replied, David, not yet. Let them stew. Sliding his phone back into his pocket, David leaned his head against the window. The glass was cold against his temple, a stark contrast to the heat rising in his chest. He wasn't angry in the way most would expect, no fiery outrage or desire for revenge. His anger was quiet, methodical, a slow-burning flame that fueled his next move. The weight of the past. As David stared out at the endless expanse of clouds, memories began to surface, moments he had spent years trying to bury. He thought of his first job interview, fresh out of college, when the hiring manager had glanced at his resume, looked him up and down, and said, "We're looking for someone who will fit in with the team." He remembered the countless times he had walked into boardrooms and seen the disbelief in his colleagues' eyes when he spoke with authority and brilliance. He remembered the hotel lobbies, the luxury stores, the high-end restaurants where he was treated like an outsider until he flashed a black card or dropped his name. David closed his eyes, steadying his breath. He had spent his life navigating these unspoken barriers, fighting battles most didn't even see. Today was no different. The calls begin. 10 minutes later, whispers spread through the first-class cabin. Passengers glanced toward the galley, where Paul Richardson spoke urgently into the in-flight phone. Rebecca stood nearby, her arms crossed tightly, her polished demeanor cracking at the edges. David didn't need to hear the conversation to know what was happening. Word of the incident had reached someone higher up, likely a corporate manager on the ground. Calls were being made, emails exchanged. The ripple effect was growing. David's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Jasmine. It was James Porter, the CEO of the airline. David smirked, ignoring the call. He wasn't ready to answer yet. Let them sweat, he thought. Passengers take notice. The man seated next to David finally spoke, his voice hesitant. "Excuse me, you're David Sinclair, right?" David turned to him, offering a polite nod. "I am." The man shifted nervously. "I read about you in Fords. You're the guy who's building those schools in Africa, right?" David smiled faintly. "Among other things." The man's expression softened into admiration. "I just wanted to say, what happened back there wasn't right. I saw the whole thing. You didn't deserve that." David met the man's eyes, his smile fading slightly. "It's not the first time," he said quietly. The man nodded, his face flushing with a mixture of guilt and discomfort. "Well, if there's anything I can do, just wanted you to know not everyone feels that way." David nodded. "Thank you." The exchange, though brief, was a reminder of the silent spectators who often stood on the sidelines, watching injustice unfold without intervening. Rebecca's unease. Rebecca passed through the cabin again, this time carrying the drinks cart. Her steps faltered as she approached David's row, her gaze darting toward him before quickly looking away. "Would you like something to drink, Mr. Sinclair?" she asked, her voice clipped but cautious. David looked up at her, his expression unreadable. "No, thank you," he said simply. The faintest flicker of frustration crossed her face before she moved on. "The groundwork is laid." As the plane began its descent, the tension in the cabin was palpable. David could feel it in the way the crew avoided his gaze, in the hurried movements of Rebecca and Paul, and in the whispers that rippled through the first-class section. David's phone buzzed again, a text from James Porter. "James. David, we need to talk. This has gone too far." David stared at the message, considering his options. He could answer now, let James offer his apologies and promises to make things right, or he could wait, let the weight of the situation grow heavier until it became impossible to ignore. David slipped his phone into his pocket. Not yet. As the plane touched down, and the cabin filled with the sounds of passengers gathering their belongings, David remained seated. He watched as Rebecca and Paul hovered near the front of the plane, their movements stiff and uncertain. When it was finally his turn to disembark, David rose slowly, his presence commanding even in the cramped economy section. He walked past Rebecca and Paul without a word, his silence speaking louder than any confrontation could. But as he stepped onto the jet bridge, he knew this was only the beginning. The storm had been set in motion, and David Sinclair was prepared to see it through to the end. The storm gained strength. Arrival at the terminal. The airport terminal was alive with movement, the bustle of travelers merging into a symphony of voices and footsteps. David Sinclair stepped off the jet bridge with measured steps, his face calm but his mind calculating. The cool air of the terminal brushed against his face, contrasting sharply with the heat of the confrontation that still simmered within him. Rebecca Morrison had been visibly tense as David passed her. She had tried to offer a polite "thank you for flying with us," but her voice faltered, and her forced smile barely masked her unease. David hadn't replied. Instead, he had met her gaze briefly, just long enough to let her know this wasn't over. Now, walking through the terminal, David's phone buzzed again. It was James Porter, the CEO of the airline. For the third time, David ignored the call. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. The waiting game. David entered the VIP lounge, where the atmosphere was a stark contrast to the chaos of the terminal. The soft hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the space. He found a seat by the window, where he could watch planes taxiing on the runway. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his messages. Jasmine had sent another update. Jasmine. Words spreading. Corporate scrambling. Call me when you're ready to move. David smiled faintly. Jasmine was efficient, always 2 steps ahead. He replied, "David, let them squirm a little longer." As he sipped his coffee, he noticed passengers from his flight entering the lounge. Some glanced his way, their expressions a mix of curiosity and recognition. A few whispered among themselves. David caught snippets of their conversation. "That's him, the guy they moved to economy." Did you see how calm he was? I would have lost it. He's the CEO of some big tech company, right? David ignored them, his focus shifting back to his phone. He wasn't here to entertain whispers. He was here to set things in motion. Corporate in crisis. Meanwhile, in the airline's corporate headquarters, the situation was escalating. James Porter paced his office, his phone pressed to his ear. I need a full report on this. Now, he barked. I don't care if it's the weekend. Get me the flight logs, the crew's statements, and every passenger complaint we've received in the past 6 months. And someone get me Laura from legal. His assistant hesitated at the door. Sir, there's already media chatter about the incident. A few tweets and posts from passengers are gaining traction. James groaned, running a hand through his hair. Perfect. Just what we need. A PR nightmare. Back in the lounge, David's phone buzzed. This time it was an email from Lisa Howard, the airline's vice president of customer relations. The subject line read, Urgent. Request to resolve incident immediately. David opened the email and scanned its contents. Lisa, Mr. Sinclair, we deeply regret the events that occurred during your recent flight. Please know that we are taking this matter very seriously and are committed to resolving it to your satisfaction. We would like to schedule a call at your earliest convenience to discuss next steps. David set the phone down, his expression unreadable. They were panicking, as they should, but a carefully worded email wasn't enough. A media storm brewing. Across the lounge, a passenger approached cautiously. She was a young woman in her early 30s, her casual attire suggesting she wasn't part of the usual corporate crowd. Excuse me, Mr. Sinclair, she began hesitantly. I just wanted to say I saw what happened on the flight. It wasn't right. David looked up, offering a polite smile. Thank you. I'm a journalist, she continued, lowering her voice. And I think people need to hear about this. Would you be willing to share your story? David studied her for a moment, considering her offer. What's your name? Emily Carter, she replied, extending a hand. I work for the Independent Voice. We cover stories about systemic issues, social justice, corporate accountability, that kind of thing. David shook her hand but didn't commit. I appreciate your interest, Emily. But for now, I'll let the airline handle their mess. Emily nodded, her expression understanding but persistent. If you change your mind, here's my card. David pocketed the card, knowing it might come in handy later. The first strike. As the afternoon wore on, David finally returned James Porter's call. The CEO's voice was tense but eager to please. David, thank you for calling back. I want to start by apologizing personally for what happened on your flight. This is unacceptable, and I assure you, we're taking immediate action to address it. David's tone was calm but firm. James, I appreciate your apology, but words aren't enough. This isn't about me. It's about a culture that allows people like Rebecca Morrison to believe they can make decisions like that without consequences. James cleared his throat. I understand, and we're already conducting a review of our policies. Rebecca has been suspended pending an investigation. David leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the planes outside. Suspension isn't enough. You need to look at the bigger picture, James. How many other passengers have been treated this way, but didn't have the platform or resources to fight back? What are you doing to address that? James hesitated. We're open to suggestions, David, if you have ideas for how we can improve. David cut him off. I don't want to give you ideas, James. I want to see action. Start with an internal audit. Every passenger complaint, every policy decision, every instance of misconduct by your crew. Publish the results. Let the public see what's really happening. James's silence was telling. That's a significant request, he said finally. It's not a request, David replied. It's the cost of doing business with integrity. Setting the stage. By the time the call ended, David knew he had planted the first seeds of change. But he also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The airline would resist transparency, fearing the damage it could do to their reputation. But David wasn't interested in playing nice. He picked up Emily Carter's card and sent her a brief text. "David, I might have a story for you. Stay tuned." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in shades of gold and orange, David felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they didn't belong. This wasn't just a storm. It was a reckoning. The reckoning begins. The quiet before the tempest. David Sinclair's penthouse suite overlooked the glittering expanse of the Los Angeles skyline. It was the kind of view reserved for those who had fought their way to the top. But tonight, the beauty of it felt hollow. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his phone in hand, rereading the carefully worded apology email from Lisa Howard. It wasn't enough. Not by a long shot. He tapped the glass lightly with his knuckles, his mind piecing together his next moves like a grandmaster preparing for the endgame. The airline thought they could contain this, a suspension here, an internal review there, and a string of polished press releases. But David knew their tactics. This wasn't about fixing the problem. It was about silencing it. David picked up the phone and called Jasmine. She answered on the first ring. "David," she said, her voice brisk and professional. "I've been tracking the chatter. Passengers from the flight are starting to speak out online. A few Twitter threads and TikToks are gaining traction. Nothing viral yet, but it's picking up momentum." "Good," David replied. "We'll let it simmer for now. How's the media outreach going?" "I reached out to a few reporters who specialize in corporate accountability. They're interested, but they're waiting for you to go on record. Emily Carter is particularly eager. She seems sharp." David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Let's keep her in play. But I'm not ready to talk publicly yet. The airline needs to squirm a little more before I give them a headline." Jasmine chuckled softly. "You've got them on edge already. James Porter called me twice today, practically begging for a meeting." "Let him wait," David said firmly. "This isn't about him or me. It's about the message." Pressure mounts. The following morning, the airline's corporate offices were in disarray. Lisa Howard sat in a glass-walled conference room with her crisis management team. The tension in the room was palpable as Lisa flipped through a dossier of passenger complaints that had surfaced in the past 24 hours. "This is a mess," she said, her tone sharp. "We've got threads online accusing us of systemic discrimination. Some are calling for a boycott. And to make matters worse, Sinclair hasn't responded to our outreach. We need to get ahead of this before it spirals." Across the table, Thomas Grady, the airline's legal counsel, leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "If Sinclair goes public, we're looking at significant reputational damage. He's not just any passenger. He's a billionaire with media connections and a spotless reputation. He doesn't need us, but we sure as hell don't want him against us." Lisa exhaled heavily. "We need a direct conversation with him. Offer a settlement, first-class upgrades for life, a generous donation to his foundation. Whatever it takes. Just keep this out of the press." A junior executive raised a tentative hand. "What about the internal audit he's demanding? He made it clear he wants transparency." Grady shook his head. "An audit like that would expose us to lawsuits. No way we agree to that." Lisa nodded. "Then we need to convince him there's another way to address this." But as the meeting adjourned, Lisa felt the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She knew David Sinclair wasn't the kind of man to be placated with token gestures. David's strategic strike. Later that afternoon, David sat in a quiet cafe, his laptop open in front of him. The journalist, Emily Carter, sat across from him, a recorder on the table between them. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Emily asked. Her tone was cautious but intrigued. "Once we publish, this story is going to take on a life of its own." David leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't just about me, Emily. It's about everyone who's ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small because of how they look or where they come from. If my story can shine a light on that, then it's worth it." Emily nodded, her eyes sharp with focus. "Tell me everything." From the beginning, David recounted the events of the flight, his voice steady but charged with emotion. He spoke not just about the indignity of being moved from first class, but about the broader implications, the silent biases, and systemic inequities that allowed such actions to occur without consequence. Emily listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. By the time David finished, her expression was a mix of anger and determination. "This isn't just a story," she said. "This is a reckoning." David smiled faintly. "That's the idea." The article drops. 2 days later, Emily's article was published online under the headline, "Billionaire CEO David Sinclair speaks out against airline bias. This isn't about a seat, it's about dignity." The piece was a masterclass in storytelling, weaving David's personal experience with broader issues of systemic discrimination. It included testimonials from other passengers on the flight and referenced similar complaints against the airline. Within hours, the article went viral. Social media exploded with outrage, and #RespectTheSeat began trending worldwide. Celebrities, activists, and everyday travelers shared their own stories of mistreatment, adding fuel to the fire. The airline issued a public statement, but it was drowned out by the flood of criticism. Corporate scramble. In the wake of the article, the airline's stock took a hit, and their PR team was overwhelmed with inquiries. James Porter called an emergency board meeting, his frustration evident as he addressed the room. "This is a disaster," he said, slamming a stack of papers onto the table. "We should have handled this the moment it happened. Now it's out of our control." Lisa Howard spoke up, her tone firm. "We need to meet Sinclair's demands. Agree to the audit. Show the public we're serious about change." Grady interjected, his voice laced with frustration. "An audit will open us up to lawsuits. It's a Pandora's box." Lisa shot him a glare. "We're already in Pandora's box, Thomas. The only way out is to own this and prove we're willing to do better." James nodded reluctantly. "Set up a meeting with Sinclair. This time, we do it on his terms." David holds the line. When the airline finally reached out, David agreed to meet, but not in a boardroom. He chose a neutral venue, a community center where his foundation was funding STEM programs for underprivileged youth. James Porter and Lisa Howard arrived with their team, visibly uncomfortable in the modest surroundings. David greeted them with his usual calm demeanor, but wasted no time getting to the point. "This isn't about settling, James," David said, his tone firm. "It's about accountability. The audit is non-negotiable, and I want a public commitment to reform, not a press release, but a real, measurable plan." James hesitated, glancing at Lisa, who nodded. "We'll agree to the audit," James said finally, "and we'll work with your foundation to develop the reform plan." David studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "Good. Let's get to work." The first steps. The airline's announcement of the audit and reform plan was met with cautious optimism. David's involvement ensured the process had credibility, and the public began to see the company's actions as more than just damage control. For David, the fight wasn't over. He knew systemic change took time, and this was just the beginning. But as he walked out of the meeting, he felt a sense of accomplishment. The storm he had unleashed wasn't about destruction. It was about clearing the path for something better. The reform in motion. The aftermath of accountability. The airline's announcement of the audit sent ripples through the corporate world. News outlets dissected the move, and experts debated whether it was a genuine step toward reform or merely a ploy to mitigate public outrage. Regardless of the motive, one thing was clear. David Sinclair's quiet resistance had forced a multi-billion-dollar corporation to confront its shortcomings. For David, however, the work had just begun. Seated in his sleek downtown office, he reviewed a preliminary report sent by Lisa Howard. The document outlined the airline's plan to conduct an internal audit, but its language was vague, filled with corporate jargon that skirted around real accountability. David's jaw tightened as he read phrases like identify areas for improvement and commit to a culture of inclusivity. He picked up his phone and dialed Lisa. She answered after a few rings, her voice wary but professional. "Mr. Sinclair, I assume you've received the preliminary report," she said. "I have," David replied, his tone calm but firm. "And I'm not impressed. This isn't what we agreed to, Lisa. If you want real change, it's going to take more than hollow promises and vague commitments." Lisa sighed. "We're working on it, David. But you have to understand, this is uncharted territory for us. A full audit could expose us to liabilities." "That's the point," David interrupted. "Liability is accountability. If your company isn't prepared to face the consequences of its actions, then you're not prepared to fix the problem." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Lisa spoke, her voice quieter. "What exactly are you asking for?" "A third-party audit," David said. "Independent investigators with no ties to your company. And I want the results published. Every finding, every recommendation, no redactions. If you're serious about reform, you'll agree to transparency." Lisa hesitated. "That's a big ask, David." "It's the bare minimum," David countered. "If you're not willing to do this, then you're not willing to change." The pushback. While David waited for the airline's response, he began assembling a team of his own. Through his foundation, he reached out to civil rights advocates, legal experts, and industry insiders. He wanted to ensure that the audit wasn't just a symbolic gesture, but a meaningful step toward dismantling systemic bias. As news of the audit spread, other companies began to take notice. Executives whispered about the potential fallout, wondering if they, too, could be forced into similar accountability measures. David's actions were setting a precedent, and it made people in power uncomfortable. Unsurprisingly, there was pushback. Anonymous sources within the airline leaked stories to the press, framing the audit as a witch hunt driven by David's personal vendetta. Commentators on social media debated whether he was going too far. David remained unfazed. He knew that change always came with resistance. The airline's concession. A week later, Lisa called with an update. "David," she began, her tone cautious, "the board has approved your request for a third-party audit. We've already reached out to a consulting firm specializing in corporate accountability." David allowed himself a small smile. "Good. When do they start?" "They'll begin preliminary interviews next month," Lisa said. "But we'll need your involvement to shape the scope of the investigation. The board wants to ensure the process is fair and balanced." David's voice hardened. "Fair and balanced shouldn't mean watered down, Lisa. If this audit isn't thorough, it'll only do more harm than good." "I understand," she replied. "And I'll do everything I can to ensure it's comprehensive. But I need your help to make this work." David agreed, though he remained skeptical. He knew this was just the first step in a long and arduous journey, the first signs of change. As the audit began, small but significant changes started to emerge. The airline introduced new training programs for its employees, focusing on unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity. Rebecca Morrison, the flight attendant who had sparked the controversy, publicly apologized and announced that she was stepping away from her role to reflect on her actions. David watched these developments with cautious optimism. He appreciated the gestures, but he knew they weren't enough. True reform would require systemic change, not just surface-level adjustments. Meanwhile, the audit team began their work. They interviewed employees at every level of the company, from entry-level staff to senior executives. They reviewed years' worth of customer complaints, analyzed hiring and promotion practices, and scrutinized the company's internal policies. David stayed involved throughout the process, attending meetings and offering his insights. He pushed for transparency at every turn, insisting that the audit's findings be shared publicly, even if they painted the airline in a negative light. a broader impact. As the audit progressed, its impact began to ripple beyond the airline. Other companies in the travel industry started conducting their own internal reviews, hoping to avoid the kind of scrutiny the airline was facing. Advocacy groups used David's story as a rallying cry, demanding accountability from corporations across industries. David was inundated with interview requests, speaking engagements, and collaboration offers. He used these opportunities to amplify the message that had driven his actions from the start. Respect and dignity weren't privileges, they were rights. One evening, as David prepared for a televised interview, Jasmine called with an update. "You've started a movement, David," she said. "People are calling it the Sinclair Standard. Companies are scrambling to meet it." David chuckled softly. "I didn't set out to create a standard, Jasmine. I just wanted a seat. And now you've given millions of people a voice," she replied. "That's bigger than any seat." The audit report. Months later, the audit report was completed and made public. It revealed systemic issues within the airline, including discriminatory practices in hiring, biased treatment of passengers, and a lack of accountability at the managerial level. The findings were damning, but they also provided a roadmap for change. The airline announced a comprehensive reform plan, including new policies, accountability measures, and a commitment to ongoing audits. David was invited to speak at a press conference where the report was unveiled. Standing before a room filled with journalists and cameras, he delivered a powerful message. This isn't just about one airline or one incident. It's about challenging the systems that allow injustice to thrive in silence. It's about creating a world where respect and dignity are the default, not the exception. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with accountability. And today, we've taken the first step. The room erupted in applause, but David knew the work was far from over. A personal victory. That evening, David sat on his balcony, watching the city lights twinkle like stars. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, from the moment he was asked to leave his seat to this moment of quiet triumph. His phone buzzed with a message from Lisa. "Lisa, thank you for pushing us to be better. This wouldn't have happened without you." David smiled faintly, typing a brief reply. "David, it was never about me. It's about what's right." As he set the phone down, he felt a sense of peace. The storm he had unleashed had cleared the way for something better, and though there was still work to be done, he knew the sky was brighter because of it. A legacy forged in action. The ripples of change. 6 months after the audit report was published, the airline industry had begun to feel the full weight of its implications. The term Sinclair Standard had become shorthand for corporate accountability, a benchmark that extended far beyond the airline that had sparked the controversy. Industries from hospitality to finance were revisiting their policies, fearing the public and professional scrutiny that had unfolded under David Sinclair's unyielding gaze. David, however, wasn't basking in the aftermath. His focus had shifted toward ensuring that the changes promised were not only implemented but sustained. He spent his mornings at his foundation's office, reviewing proposals from other companies that sought his guidance on building equitable practices. Afternoons were dedicated to mentoring young leaders and entrepreneurs, many of whom had experienced similar injustices. One evening, David sat in the boardroom of his foundation, surrounded by a team of advisors. On the table lay a stack of letters from individuals across the world who had been inspired by his stand. One in particular caught his eye, a handwritten note from a high school student in Alabama. "Mr. Sinclair," it read, "I saw what you did and how you didn't let them silence you. It made me realize that I don't have to stay quiet either. I just wanted to say thank you for being brave enough to stand up so people like me could have a voice." David read the letter twice, his heart heavy yet hopeful. This was why he had fought, not for recognition or power, but to show others that dignity was worth defending. Rebecca Morrison's journey. While David pushed forward, the woman who had ignited the storm, Rebecca Morrison, was navigating a storm of her own. Her suspension from the airline had turned into a resignation after the audit revealed a pattern of complaints against her. Public scrutiny had followed her like a shadow, and she had retreated from the public eye. One afternoon, David received an unexpected email. Subject: Request for a meeting. From Rebecca Morrison. David's initial reaction was skepticism. He had no interest in reopening old wounds, but something about the email's tone caught his attention. It was apologetic, almost pleading. Against his better judgment, he replied, "The meeting." A week later, David sat across from Rebecca in a quiet cafe far removed from the bustling city. She looked different, her once impeccable uniform replaced by simple clothes, her confident demeanor replaced by a quiet unease. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," Rebecca began, her voice subdued. David nodded, letting her speak. "I spent the last few months reflecting," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped her coffee cup. "What I did that day, it wasn't just a mistake. It was part of a pattern I didn't even realize I was part of. I acted on assumptions, ones I didn't even know I held, and I want to say I'm sorry. Not just to you, but to everyone I've wronged." David studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What made you reach out?" he finally asked. Rebecca hesitated, then said, "The audit. Seeing everything laid bare like that, it was a wake-up call. I thought I was doing my job, but I realize now that I was enforcing systems that hurt people. I want to do better." David leaned forward slightly. "Words are easy, Rebecca. What are you doing to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Rebecca met his gaze, her voice steadying. "I've started volunteering with a group that trains people on recognizing and addressing bias. I'm also taking courses on diversity and inclusion. I know it's not enough, but it's a start." David nodded slowly. "Accountability is a process, not a moment. If you're serious about this, then keep going. Not for me, but for the people who come after you." Rebecca nodded, a glimmer of resolve in her eyes. A new standard. As the airline worked to implement the changes outlined in the audit, David remained involved, attending quarterly meetings and consulting on policy updates. His presence ensured that the company didn't backtrack on its promises, and his insights helped shape a new era of corporate accountability. Other airlines took note, quietly adopting similar measures to avoid becoming the next headline. The ripple effect extended to industries David hadn't anticipated. Universities, healthcare providers, and even government agencies began conducting their own internal reviews, inspired by the transparency the audit had demonstrated. David's foundation launched a new initiative, the Sinclair Accountability Program, offering resources and training to organizations seeking to dismantle systemic bias. Applications poured in from around the world, from small nonprofits to Fortune 500 companies. The human element. In the midst of this whirlwind of change, David never lost sight of the individuals at the heart of the issue. One day, while visiting one of his foundation's STEM programs in Chicago, he met a young woman named Keisha. Keisha was a high school senior with dreams of becoming an aerospace engineer, but she had faced countless barriers. Teachers who underestimated her, guidance counselors who pushed her towards safer career paths, and peers who doubted her abilities. David sat with her in the program's workshop, listening as she shared her story. "You know," David said, "when I was your age, I had people telling me I wouldn't make it too. They saw my potential as a threat, not an asset. But you know what I learned?" Keisha shook her head. "That their doubts said more about them than they did about me. Your dreams are yours, Keisha. Don't let anyone shrink them." Keisha's eyes lit up, and David felt a sense of purpose reignite within him. These moments, he realized, were just as important as the boardrooms and press conferences. The legacy. A year after the incident on the flight, David was invited to speak at a global summit on corporate responsibility. Standing before an audience of world leaders, CEOs, and activists, he reflected on the journey that had brought him there. "This isn't a story about a seat on a plane," he began. "It's a story about what happens when we stop accepting the status quo and start demanding better. It's about recognizing that dignity isn't something we earn, it's something we're born with. And it's about understanding that every small act of resistance creates ripples that can lead to waves of change. The audience rose to their feet, their applause echoing through the hall. As David stepped off the stage, Jasmine met him with a smile. "You've done it," she said. David shook his head, his expression serious. "No, we've started it. The real work is just beginning." The sky beyond. That night, David sat alone on his balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before him. He thought of his father's words. A man's dignity isn't in what he owns. It's in what he refuses to let them take from him. David had refused, not just for himself but for countless others. And though the fight was far from over, he knew the foundation had been laid. Above him, a plane's lights blinked against the dark sky. For a moment, he wondered who was sitting in seat 12A, and whether they knew the cost of what it had taken to claim that space. David smiled faintly, raising a glass to the stars. The sky, after all, was big enough for everyone. The flight toward change. The personal impact. The weeks following the summit were a whirlwind for David. The Sinclair Accountability Program was rapidly gaining traction, and partnerships with global organizations were pouring in. But amidst the public accolades and professional commitments, David found moments of quiet reflection that reminded him of why he had started this journey. One such moment came when he received a letter from an unexpected source, Paul Richardson, the flight supervisor from the day of the incident. "Mr. Sinclair," the letter began, "I don't expect forgiveness, but I owe you my gratitude. That day on the flight, I failed to do what was right. I followed the path of least resistance, prioritizing protocol over decency. Watching what you've done since has taught me more than I could ever learn from a training manual. I've resigned from my position and am pursuing work where I can contribute to positive change. I wanted you to know that your actions didn't just impact systems, they impacted individuals like me. Thank you." David folded the letter carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. It wasn't about redemption for Paul, but it was proof that ripples could reach even the most unlikely places. Rebecca's next step. Months after their meeting in the cafe, Rebecca Morrison reached out again. This time, it wasn't to apologize. It was to share. "I've been working with a nonprofit that focuses on workforce inclusivity," she wrote in an email. "They've asked me to join their leadership team, and I've accepted. I'm not asking for your approval, but I wanted to thank you for challenging me to be better." David replied simply, "Accountability isn't a destination, Rebecca, it's a journey. Keep walking the path." A new generation of leaders. The Sinclair Accountability Program began hosting an annual conference, bringing together leaders, activists, and innovators committed to fostering systemic change. The inaugural event, held in New York, was attended by thousands, including CEOs of major corporations, government officials, and students eager to make a difference. During the event, David introduced a new initiative, the Sinclair Fellowship, a program designed to support young leaders from marginalized communities. The first cohort included Keisha, the aspiring aerospace engineer he had met in Chicago. Standing on the stage, Keisha spoke about how the fellowship had given her the tools and confidence to pursue her dreams. "Mr. Sinclair taught me that no dream is too big and no barrier is too strong if you have the right people in your corner," she said, her voice steady and resolute. David watched her with pride, knowing that this was the real legacy, empowering others to carry the torch forward. The airline's transformation. A year after the audit, the airline released a comprehensive report detailing the changes they had implemented. The findings were stark. Over the years, thousands of passengers had faced discriminatory practices, but the reforms were equally significant. The airline had overhauled its training programs, introduced new hiring practices to ensure diversity, and implemented a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. They had also established a passenger advocacy board to ensure accountability. David attended the press conference where these changes were announced, sitting quietly in the audience. When Lisa Howard spotted him afterward, she approached, her expression a mix of relief and respect. "We couldn't have done this without you," she said. David shook his head. "You could have. It just took someone to show you why you needed to." Lisa extended her hand. "Thank you, David, for not letting us off the hook." He shook her hand, but his mind was already on the next challenge. The last flight. Months later, David found himself boarding another flight. This time, he was flying to Nairobi to visit one of the schools his foundation had funded. As he settled into his seat in first class, he noticed a flight attendant approaching. "Mr. Sinclair," she said, her voice warm and professional. "Welcome aboard. If there's anything you need during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask." David smiled. There was no tension in her tone, no underlying dismissal. For the first time in a long while, he felt like just another passenger. As the plane ascended, David gazed out the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The battles he had fought weren't over. There were always more systems to challenge, more barriers to break. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The sky was vast, open, and full of possibility. And this time, David Sinclair wasn't just occupying his seat. He was reclaiming it for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Epilogue. A ripple that became a wave. Years later, historians and journalists would look back on David Sinclair's stand as a turning point, not just for the airline industry, but for corporate accountability as a whole. The Sinclair Standard became a global movement, inspiring organizations to prioritize dignity, equity, and transparency. For David, the journey was never about creating a legacy. It was about making the world a little fairer, one seat at a time. As he often told the young leaders he mentored, "Change doesn't come when we wait for someone else to act. It comes when we decide that enough is enough and take the first step ourselves. That's how we turn ripples into waves." David Sinclair's wave had reshaped the world, and it all started at 30,000 feet.